U.S. President Barack Obama recently referred to Venezuela as an extraordinary threat to national security and imposed sanctions against 7 officials accused of human rights and other violations. The action was promptly condemned by President Nicolas Maduro, who suggested his country should get ready for military aggression from the United States. It's a familiar situation between these two countries. Despite the war of words, the U.S. continues to buy Venezuelan oil. To better understand this latest development, we spoke to political analyst Laura Carlsen. Laura, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Elaine.
You know, many analysts are calling President Barack Obama's executive order on Venezuela and the sanctions that followed a strategic mistake. What do you make of it? Do you agree?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a mistake, and it's kind of hard to understand why he did it. The language in it is so over the top. Venezuela as a national security threat. And this has sparked a lot of opposition and outrage from other countries throughout Latin America, and not just the predictable response from Venezuela. In addition, it's really actually strengthened the government of Nicolas Maduro, because he can now claim that we have an external enemy, and that always helps to unite a country behind a president. And in fact, he's carrying out military maneuvers and talking about an imminent U.S. attack on the country. And it's weakened the opposition in a way, too, because the opposition, in fact, they've said, we don't even agree with these sanctions. And as much as they're linked to the United States, it weakens them as an internal opposition within Venezuela on a kind of a nationalist basis.
Well, beyond the rhetoric, what are the consequences for those 7 Venezuelan officials that were sanctioned against?
Well, the consequences for them, the sanctions, what they say is that they're denied entry into the United States and their assets are blocked in the United States. And so the consequences for them, it's not immediately obvious, but they're not that severe. The consequences really are for the country as a whole, and that's in the sense that they now are displayed in this way by the United States. And this is going to be a major problem.
In terms of timing, what do you think prompted the strong language, the executive order, the sanctions by the White House?
Well, that's the big question, and it's very, very difficult to answer. There really could only be 2 things that are possible. Within the Obama administration, there's always been a lot of division. There's more hawkish attitudes, and then there's more conciliatory attitudes toward the United States. And for this reason, we've seen kind of an uneven policy. In this case, clearly, Congress began the process with sanctions at the end of last year. And then the Obama administration came out with this executive order that even takes those sanctions further. And the people who are happy about this are the Cuban anti-Castro legislators and some parts of the right wing. But the other reason could have to do with the fact that there really has been a regime change agenda going on here among a large part of the government, the Pentagon and part of the State Department. And they could see Venezuela as weak at this particular moment because the economy is in a crisis, and with the lower oil prices and high inflation, Maduro is facing a lot of problems at home.
What are some of the implications for the U.S. government, especially when it comes to its relationship with countries that are aligned with Venezuela? We've heard from Ecuador, Argentina, throwing their support behind President Nicolas Maduro.
Well, that's what's so hard to understand about this. We're on the eve of the Summit of the Americas. There had been moves to come closer to some of those countries, especially the center-left countries, especially with the normalization of relations with Cuba. And so to throw this monkey wrench in is a little bit hard to understand now. And there's been unilateral opposition to these sanctions from the United States. CELAC and UNASUR, that are both organizations of Latin American countries to which the United States does not belong, have come out and said unanimously that we are opposed to this and we support Venezuela. So what they've really done is consolidated support for Venezuela in this context and left the United States really isolated.
Well, and you mentioned Cuba. The United States and Cuba are in the middle of talks to normalize relations. Cuba, obviously, a strong brother of Venezuela. So what does this do to those negotiations between the United States and Cuba? Does this put a damper on what's to come?
Well, I think the negotiations with Cuba will proceed as usual because that's a historic breakthrough and there's no stopping it. We reached a point where there was a consensus, not just in a political way that the embargo hadn't worked, but among the business community that they were interested in Cuba now and it was time to end this policy. So I think that that will proceed. But as far as what happens in the relationship with Cuba, the geopolitical sense of it that we'll see at the Summit of the Americas, that's another question, and it will make relationship and even the negotiations there a little bit more difficult, no doubt.
And despite the tension between the United States and Venezuela, there's still the buying of oil by the United States.
Well, that's true. I mean, if they really wanted to isolate Venezuela, you would see something very different. So you can't see this measure as anything but a kind of a rhetorical throwing down the glove. And that's what's hard to understand, why at this particular moment and in this particular way. Because commercial relationships are going on, and in fact the State Department has even kind of backtracked and saying, well, we had to do this executive order because that's what you have to do to back up the sanctions against these 7 individuals, and tried to make it not seem like as big a deal as it is, but it's already caused a lot of damage.
All right, Laura Carlsen, as always, we appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you for joining us here on America's Now.
Thank you.